We turn now to a discussion about when platform policies can be the difference between life and death. In war, social media has become an extension of the physical battlefield. And in conflict zones and unstable states, the online information environment can have catalytic effects, and rarely for the better. This is an issue with very few global norms or rules of engagement. And I'm pleased to introduce DFR Lab non-resident fellow Arjun Bisen for this important conversation.
Thank you, and hi and welcome everyone. As mentioned, I'm a non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm very excited to kick off today's discussion on what I think is one of the most important and under-discussed topics when it comes to information disorder. And that is the role of social media and disinformation in conflict environments. Now, needless to say, conflict zones are already very fragile environments. And today we're going to explore how digital disinformation can make that even worse to catastrophic effect. We'll also discuss efforts underway to limit the risk of disinformation around conflicts and some of the more novel ideas that are being discussed at the moment. So let's get into it. To help our audience understand the kinds of issues we're actually talking about, I'll start off by asking our panelists to briefly share the various ways in which they've observed social media and disinformation campaigns affect conflicts. So passing over to Mod, as an advisor on social media and conflict mediation at the Center of Humanitarian Dialogue, perhaps I could ask you to go first. Would you be able to share your focus area on how disinformation impacts conflicts?
Sure. Thanks so much, Arjun, for having me. I'm really happy to be part of this panel. So yeah, at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, or HD, we work on mediating conflict. So trying to find ways to convince conflict parties to come to the table and engage in dialogue and forge agreements. And really, over recent years, I think we've seen firsthand exactly what Graham was just mentioning. So social media's increasing impact on essentially almost all of the countries where we are working. And to come to your question about how this plays out, I think there are countless ways that disinformation is affecting conflict that I'm sure many of us will get into in this panel, but I just want to talk about one, the kind of area that I see the most in my day-to-day work at HD. And that is the way that disinformation is being used to undermine peace processes. So in many of the places where we're working, we're seeing conflict parties using social media, including disinformation campaigns, to undermine the efforts to end war and to make an already really difficult job of negotiating peace even harder. So just to give you a couple of examples, in Libya at the end of last year, we saw a coordinated disinformation campaign, a network of accounts that Facebook actually removed after the fact that was seeking to undermine the Libya Political Dialogue Forum. So this was a big UN-led mediation event. We've seen also in the Philippines efforts to use social media to undermine attempts to forge peace with the communist movement. We've seen in Cameroon online hate speech exacerbating tensions between parties, making it harder to find common ground, harder to find spaces for dialogue. And the list goes on. And I could give you lots of examples. And in terms of how this plays out, obviously it varies by country, it varies by actor. We see some of the concerning trends we're seeing are harassment against negotiators or participants in peace talks, disinformation, like, for example, fake peace agreements that are circulated. We saw that in Libya, or narrative laundering campaigns. So creating and then spreading narratives that are deliberately trying to undermine a peace process or a negotiating process. All the tactics are things that have been talked about a lot in this conference. So hashtag laundering, inauthentic accounts, often accounts posing as local media outlets, working cross-platform, so switching from Twitter to Facebook to radio, TV, etc. So those are some of the tactics we're seeing. And just to end by saying, really, the effects of this are really real, really concerning. We're seeing this exacerbating conflict and making, as I said at the beginning, the kind of efforts to forge peace more challenging. So social media, it's clear, is becoming an increasingly important weapon in conflict parties' armory. And I think we all need to develop appropriate responses. So that's why I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Thanks, Maud, for that spotlight on how disinfo is impacting peace processes. Next, I'd like to pass over to Mark. As an advisor to the ICRC, an organization that's so close to the ground on these conflicts, have you seen online disinformation and dangerous speech impact conflicts around the world? And how does it fit into this broader narrative of propaganda and war?
Thanks so much, Arjun, and it's great to be here with you and with all the panelists today. As you mentioned, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is a humanitarian organization working with a mandate to protect and assist victims of armed conflict. And as you mentioned, I mean, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, in the traditional words, rumors and propaganda, these are not new, right? But digital technology has supersized their impact by introducing new paradigms of scale, speed, and reach. And one of our key findings as we've been exploring these issues over the past few years is that the rapid evolution of digital information technologies is turning mis and disinformation into an exacerbating and accelerating driver of conflict dynamics in terms of violence, harm to populations. This can mean direct or indirect humanitarian consequences affecting civilian populations. It may increase people's exposure to risks and vulnerabilities and can lead to physical harm. For example, when online hate speech incites violence against minority groups. It can also contribute to psychological and social harm through online, offline harassment, defamation, intimidation, which in turn can lead to persecution, discrimination, and displacement. From our perspective, the focus that we've seen to date on the information disorder as it relates to COVID, as it relates to democracy and elections is hugely important. But as you mentioned at the top, the focus and the exploration and the knowledge on conflict dynamics, we think is really warranted to have further investment in, because our belief is that if disinformation is not addressed in these contexts, there's a real risk that it will contribute to further entrench already difficult and protracted conflict situations.
Thanks, Mark. That's really useful from the ICRC perspective. Next, I'd like to pass to Noura, and apologies in advance for any audiovisual issues she might be facing. But as someone who's actually seen the conflict in Syria unfold firsthand, I would love to hear your perspective on the experience of online information in that conflict.
Thanks so much. I believe that my internet today insists to put me in the environment of conflict and reminds me about how I was talking to the media from Syria, from the conflict zone. I'm very glad I've been here, and I will try just to be super brief, building on the what other panelists highlighted already. Actually, in Syria, the activists in the uprising in 2011 took advantage of the digital and cyberspace. They used social media very well to mobilize, to organize, to communicate, and to talk about the social and political issues. However, I guess and other observers also and researchers note that the Syrian regime learned the lessons very well from other regimes in the region, and how the social media was a good power in the hands of the activists and human rights defenders. This is why, since the early days of the movement, the peaceful movement in Syria, we started observing youth groups on Facebook who are loyalists to Assad, and afterward we discovered that some of them are backed by the authorities, trying to separate this information, targeting the audience in Syria domestically who might be inspired by the discussion and by the narrative of the movement, trying to separate and back the official conspiracy theory about the foreign interference in Syria and the the conspiracy that the Syrian government is under attack by the regional actors. One of the examples was actually when a mass protests were in Banyas took place in April 2011, and Banyas was under siege. The social media was full of all of this narrative about 4 Israeli commanders with 2 Jordanian commanders were there, and this is why the government is fighting the enemies there, while the fact that the government was putting the peaceful protesters under siege and attacking them and trying just to repress the protest. As the conflict evolved to an armed conflict and more regional powers started to intervene, we started observing various actors in the disinformation, such as the growing pro-Assad group started to be backed by the Russian and Iranian expertise, and Western activists and academics and journalists who started to target the Western audience. So now we have bigger audience to consume the disinformation by the government. However, also we started observing the campaigns by ISIS, the other armed groups, alongside the regional actors like Turkey, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. As Maud mentioned, also the negotiation and peace efforts were always under attack. And definitely the death threats targeting the delegation also has been in place, alongside the leak of the documents and other tactics, with I guess might be applicable to all conflicts. But I want also here to highlight the disinformation campaigns that focus on the denial of war crimes. I came from human rights background. This is why I believe that all the time. The most vulnerable actor in any conflict is the civil society and human rights defenders. They don't have equal tools, they don't have equal resources, and all the time they are under attack with the humanitarian workers. Many of us heard about the mass disinformation campaigns targeting the white helmets in Syria, and all of these accusations around it. And such campaigns definitely started since the early days of the uprising, when the government handed over or released the body of 12-year-old boy who was detained and tortured to death. Then the accusation back then was like he was walking to sexually assault the wives of the Syrian army commanders. And I guess here, I just want to wrap up with like overall know that the risk of disinformation in the conflict zone is like, in conflict, we have all variables and tools of violence. We have the weapons, we have the absence of institution or any rule of law. We have the uncertainty, the mass uncertainty among all civilians and actors in the country and the neighboring countries. The lack of trust, and absolutely the limited resources for the independent media. So the targeted audience that might be affected by these disinformation campaigns feel uncertain and they cannot trust anyone. And yeah, moreover, the limited resources for the civil society to conduct the counter disinformation or to start acting strategically in the communication instead of using communication as a tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. That was an incredible way to bring a particular conflict and disinformation around a particular conflict to life from all the various dimensions. Really appreciate the visceral examples. Next, I'd like to pass on to Jane, who's an academic who studies the data around what we can observe online. So I'd love to hear from you about how the information sphere surrounding conflicts changes and what are the trends we get to see around conflicts.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this. I work with the International Crisis Group, which is a conflict prevention organization. And I think it's become increasingly clear working with analysts who are on the ground that social media is this really key part of virtually every conflict that we're seeing today, as Maud mentioned. social media has been really revolutionary in terms of the data that we have in conflict settings. It's been both kind of I mean, as it always is, social media is very much a double-edged sword. Social media has given us the tools to be able to track human rights violations in ways that we didn't have before. At Crisis Group, we've used it as a way to track criminal groups in Mexico. It's given us a great deal of insight into dynamics on the ground that we might not normally have, effectively by allowing citizens to be journalists themselves. But with that, obviously, comes issues of disinformation, the difficulty of actually fact-checking information, the spread of rumors. And social media companies have really actually tried on the data side to be very transparent, with the exception of maybe TikTok, which is lagging behind here. We have CrowdTangle for Facebook. We have an academic API for Twitter, and that lets you access enormous amounts of data, enormous amounts of information that have been posted online publicly. It doesn't necessarily let you see things that have been taken down, but that's where partnerships with places like the DFR Lab have been really key in the sense of allowing these groups and organizations to look at networks before they're actually taken down. It gives you really the opportunity to be able to look across a wide variety of actors and understand within a particular conflict how prevalent things like hate speech are online, again, with the caveats that I mentioned, being able to understand, for example, the rise of polarization, being able to understand the spread of particular pieces of disinformation, and all of that can be pretty flexibly applied to different contexts in a way that I think is extremely important and that really should be pushed further and further, particularly outside the kind of traditional areas where we tend to see it, which is very focused on say, the United States, where we have a lot of information. But data can also only get us so far in conflict zones because the role of social media is so heavily contextual. And I think we've heard that from all of the other speakers. Social media really tends to be the most harmful when it's amplifying and reflecting back underlying tensions in these conflict zones. And the result of that is that one post can mean a lot of different things depending on intent. So just as a very simple example, take a photo of, say, a murdered woman, and think of the many meanings that might have depending on the context. Maybe it's a criminal group in Mexico propagandizing their violence. Maybe it's the Syrian government trying to instill fear. Maybe it's the Burmese government implying it's a woman killed by the Rohingya. Maybe it's a protest group in Colombia documenting a human rights violation. So any decision to leave that image up or to let it stay is pretty inherently political, but those politics vary really widely based on context. So I think that when we talk about data and when we talk about the role of data and in understanding these conflicts and the role that social media companies can play in that regard, I think it's very important to keep this mix of really deep contextual information, even when we're looking at these kind of large end studies and big data. I think that it has an enormous amount of promise that really hasn't fully been tapped to help us both understand conflicts on the ground and to help us understand the role of social media in perpetuating these conflicts. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Arjun.
Thanks, Jane. Great examples of how the infosphere can both be a great tool and also a vector for risk in these conflict zones. So I think our panelists have now covered the waterfront on how disinfo can impact civilians in war zones, warring parties, humanitarian workers, and also peace negotiations. So hopefully that gives the audience a clear sense of the various dimensions. Next, I'd like to discuss what can actually be done here. We have painted a bit of a bleak picture. I'd love to pass to the panel to discuss ideas for what can and should be done in response and share any success stories of what's worked well. So I'll pass on to Maud to kick off that part of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Arjun. I agree with everything that the other panelists said. I think we painted a pretty comprehensive picture of the issue here. So in terms of what we do about it, there are obviously a lot of efforts to combat social media's impact on conflict. And these range from, hate speech monitoring, fact checking by civil society organizations, to the takedown of networks and inauthentic accounts by social media platforms. I would say, though, that most of these responses, important as they are dealing with the problem that we just outlined once it's already out there in the world, right? So they're dealing with the kind of bad information once it reaches the platforms. What we see less of, and what I think is really necessary, is a set of responses that deal with the supply of this content, of these disinformation campaigns, right? So the question I think we should be asking is, what would it take to stop conflict actors, whether they be states or non-state actors, from using disinformation to undermine peace processes and to exacerbate conflict? And on that, I think there are some things that we as the kind of mediation community can do. And I think there are some things that social media platforms can do. So on the first side of things, I think mediators, and this is something we are working on a lot at HD, should really be exploring the potential of social media to be integrated into peace agreements. So this is the idea that conflict parties might actually agree to exercise restraint in the online space. In the same way, for example, they might agree to stop fighting physically via a ceasefire agreement. So this is obviously really, really hard, right? Digital weapons are cheap and effective, and they come with a lot of benefits like plausible deniability. But if you think about it, we recognize, and we just spent 20 minutes talking about this, that social media is a weapon like any other now. And yet, as the international community, we don't really have any norms to govern the digital spaces in conflict. So I think we really need to work on this, and agreements, when they are forged, is one way to do this. And just in case this is sounding completely pie in the sky, we are already doing some of this work on the ground. So towards the end of last year, we piloted a social media agreement in Indonesia around local elections. So we worked with a group of civil society organizations to actually facilitate a social media code of conduct. So this was a code that outlined how social media should be used in and around the election period. Now, this is a very modest pilot. I'm not suggesting that it's the solution, but I think what it did is it allowed us to see what could an agreement for the digital realm look like, and how could this then be applied in other cases to this domain that has so far proved relatively kind of unpreventable. So this is really early days, but I think it's really exciting work, and there's lots more to do there. And then just quickly on social media platforms, I think there is a great deal more they could be doing to lessen the impact of disinformation on conflict. And probably the single thing I think would be most impactful is if they actually developed a policy that recognizes the importance of peace processes as moments where countries can have the potential to move from violence to peace. Currently, we don't see social media platforms pay particular attention to peace processes. We don't see them treat, for example, the Libya Political Dialogue Forum in the same way they would treat an election, where they do put particular policies in place and they do kind of prioritize events where an election is in place. So I think by being aware of this issue at these particularly critical moments, i.e. moments when negotiations are underway, social media platforms could implement then some additional measures to ensure that these effects that we just outlined are minimized and mitigated. So I think it's not just the platforms that have work to do. We also have a lot of work to do, but I think there are really important steps that need to be taken from all of us.
Thanks, Maud. That's a great list of both norm development and social media content policy options. Mark, would you like to share perspectives as well from the ICRC?
Sure, and thanks again. I think, as I mentioned before, the ICRC has spent a few years trying to explore this issue. We've done some research, and we've just, from that research, put together a practical guide for our field teams to try to help them make sense of it and to try to think about ways of detecting, assessing, and potentially responding to the misinformation and disinformation that we think may lead to humanitarian consequences. We're working with our teams to pilot it now, so our understanding of what can be done by us, specifically a neutral, independent, impartial humanitarian actor, is still being developed and tested. I think that per what we were talking about before in terms of the democracy and elections and the expertise there, I think the work of that DFR Lab has done with Stanford, with University of Washington, with Graphica on election integrity project is really groundbreaking and impressive. And that type of detection capability, I think, is something that if we could look at being more available in terms of partnerships in conflict settings, and as Jane was saying, really in terms of specific language and contextual understanding and analysis, would be a huge support to organizations working in the field. I think when we talk about responses, our focus is really around trying to prevent or mitigate human suffering, as opposed to trying to create a more perfect information ecosystem. So just one thing I wanted to note there, which is, yes, content moderation, the actions of the tech companies, as Maud was saying, is extremely important. However, as Jane was mentioning, there is a tension in terms of where social media can be helpful and where social media can be harmful. And so therefore content moderation is unlikely to be a silver bullet. It's not to say that we shouldn't do things. We should continue to explore, to engage with the tech companies to push for changes. But at least from where we're looking, we also want to look on the ground in terms of, while the activity may be largely online, some of the responses may not be. As Maud was mentioning, dialogue with armed actors, with civil society, with local media, with local communities may help prevent harmful actions. And so we're really trying to explore those types of engagements and solution spaces, in addition to ideas around content moderation and engagement with tech companies. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate that update on the work of your organization. Next, I'd like to invite Noura to potentially speak from a civil society perspective. What else can be done to mitigate some of the harms?
Thanks so much. Actually, there's a lot of ideas were highlighted already by the panelists, but I can add some of them. For instance, once the conflict actors started to involve in an official peace talks, there's like some of the pressure or a code of conduct might be like, in order to hold them accountable in the future, or if anything happened, to make them commit not to do that. We know that they're gonna do that, however, but at least we will have something to hold them accountable. This is on one hand. On the other hand, I guess as some practical steps could be taken by the platforms, I guess they need to include the grassroots civil society and organizations. First of all, I'm talking here about the MENA region. When it comes to Arabic language or other languages, it's so complicated to understand the mechanism. So we cannot rely on the automation and so on. So we need to understand the context. The other day we were talking about some phrases where they might be used in context of hate speech in Syria, for instance, while in Iraq it means nothing. So we cannot rely that on general framework, but we need more local and more domestic framework to handle these issues. And they need, definitely the platforms, they need to consider the civil society and the local stakeholders as partners, not as like something to be done to act nice. And they need definitely to increase the conspiracy and conspiracy system. I will give an example about when they release, Facebook released the ads of political campaigns that didn't say anything about Syria, while we know that there's a lot of things has been done about Syria, but no one knows because we don't have information. Also, when it comes to the denial of human rights or the war crimes and human rights issues or other issues might be like touching the daily basis of civilians. There is already a function has been developed on social media platforms like the fact check button, which is so easily can be fed by reliable resources from the domestic organizations and the domestic stakeholders. So the citizens and the targeted audience will not be consuming the information, this information without having the option to check the facts and check the credibility of this information. I guess, yeah, for academics, researchers, and other stakeholders, policymakers, and donors, they definitely need to build the capacity of the local civil society to counter the disinformation. We know that there is a huge gap between the knowledge of researchers and the local civil society. We need to bridge these gaps, and we need to educate the civil society how to counter this disinformation. We know that there is a lot of complaint by the civil society. There's not enough resources to develop such strategies or to handle the disinformation. So we need to advocate for that, not because it's like something considered as luxury, because it's literally saving lives. In conflict, we need to do that, because what's going on in democracy absolutely is different than the consequences of disinformation in conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Noura. That's an important reminder of the role of having local expertise and networks on the ground. Jane, I would love to hear your perspectives of what can we learn from the data, and what are some potential other solutions we haven't explored?
Sure. I mean, this is the $1 million question, right? This is what we're all doing. There are a lot of high-level policies coming from tech companies in particular that we have kind of an intuition might improve things globally, right? There are things about the algorithm that have been highly criticized in terms of its contribution to polarization, about the way that content goes viral and whether those pieces of information should be reviewed much earlier, so that if it's something like disinformation, it gets reviewed quickly. But I agree with everyone, and I think that this is a theme that's going to keep coming up, that ultimately, this is highly contextual, and the role that social media plays is really a country level, or even more locally, a regional level question. And that is really why the problem is particularly intractable. There's not going to be a magic wand, a magic button, a magic algorithm that we can hit that solves everything everywhere. And part of that is actually the fact that these actors, conflict actors that we're talking about, are really adaptable. When we look at something like the takedown of ISIS from these major platforms, it's often treated as a real success story, in the sense that at one point they were able to have really unified social media presences and would spread a lot of information on something like Twitter. But obviously they've learned to adapt and move to different platforms and Telegram, and it's just become a more diffuse network. Now, it might still be considered a success story, but it's certainly a more complex success story than we often give it credit for. When I'm doing research on Mexican criminal groups, and the way that they use social media is pretty, in some ways, ingenious. They go platform to platform depending on effectively where they can get away with what. Myanmar is I think a really important case that's come up a lot, because it's really one of Facebook's most public and most total failures during the Rohingya crisis. But Facebook has played an extremely active role post-coup in removing the Tatmadaw, the military, from these platforms in a way that's actually been quite praised. Whereas TikTok, which has had a less clear policy, and what's effectively happened is that members of the Tatmadaw have moved onto TikTok to show kind of propaganda and displays of power. So effectively, what might spur violence is very contextual, and how these actors use these platforms is really contextual. And this is kind of a self-serving answer, because what we actually need is more research of exactly the type being done by the people on this panel about the role of social media in very specific places and how it's actually playing out in very specific contexts. And that's, I think, a really important precondition for understanding how to reduce the harm caused by social media in these contexts. Just as one example, and I think that this can be applied more broadly, in research that Crisis Group did on Cameroon, one of the major takeaways was that Facebook really needed to expand the verification system for civil society actors in the country. It's often quite easy for government ministries to get verified and treated as a trusted source, but in this case, there actually very much needed to be opposition actors who were trusted to provide a counterpoint. And without that verification system, there was much less in the way of trusted actors. There was a much less clear information environment. And so that was a pretty simple step that Facebook could take in partnership with civil society to improve information accountability. And so with that, I'll hand it back to you, Arjun, and looking forward to the rest of the Q&A.
Thanks, Jane. Some great examples, especially the look back now on how ISIS was treated and some of the new emerging trends around what's happening in Myanmar. Really, really great examples to show what can be done. I guess now we will open up to the audience for Q&A. There's one question that's already come in, which is about the ICRC guide and whether it's available for other organizations, even if it's still unproven. Mark, would you take a stab at that?
Sure. As it's still in piloting stage, we're not releasing it publicly, but part of the purpose and the reason to join with you all today is to make this plea for more research and exploration and practice in conflict settings. So we are trying to explore how to create networks of people interested in the research and interested in the practice, and exploring how we can all share resources together. So if there are people here who are interested in that, would love to be able to connect after the session and see what may be possible. But no, we're not throwing it up on the website just yet.
Great. And to our audience members, please send through any more questions you might have. In the meantime, I thought I'd pull a thread that was discussed by the panelists earlier, maybe as a complement to some of the reactive removals and cleanup of disinfo. What more can be done to sort of hold bad actors to account, and potentially on the deterrent side, other than norms? Have we seen anything else that's worked well in deterring bad actors? I'll open it up to the panel. So if anyone has any thoughts, please jump in.
Okay, I was raising my hand. I was jumping if no one wants to.
Sorry.
Yeah, sadly, many times and in many contexts around the world, many conflict zones, the bad actors might have famous people, might have journalists. So it could be like nice to have and very helpful to have this kind of global code of conduct, or start, when we don't have the tools of holding someone accountable, we can start by naming and shaming. Because if we're going to talk about the response by the people who are under attack, instead of confronting the disinformation campaign, they just retreat and they give up. Whether they give up social media, they try just to repress themselves and start this kind of censorship because it hurts, and we need to acknowledge that. Also, we need. I noticed that no one mentioned that, and I have this commitment. We need to highlight that women in conflict zone are under different kind of attacks and different kind of disinformation. It's not only about the smear campaigns, but we have all the time this gender component in the narrative targeting female activists, whether they're in any field. So we have to handle that very properly, and we need to call on the organizations who are talking about women's rights to start joining us in this call to counter and to develop tools to counter these disinformation campaigns, and also, on the other hand, to handle with the impacts of this. We need to call on organizations who care for the mental health to support the activists and the human rights defenders who are being targeted, because it leaves absolutely a lot of harm and hurt on them psychologically and mentally, and it's gonna affect them as a long term. Usually when people talk about the attackers or disinformation campaigns, we talk about the bad guys, but we forget to address the voices of the good guys who are under attack, who are the most vulnerable people in this. This is on one hand. On the other hand, we need also to mention and to keep remembering that most of the times in conflict zone, there is overlap between the disinformation campaign and the actual violence. So here, I guess we need more legal studies to see the opportunities of like call for the international jurisdictions and move forward in this kind of accountability. Hopefully it could prevent and keep and make these bad actors count to 100 before involving in such campaigns. I know I'm being like as a dreamer, but I believe that the great ideas can always start by a dream. Thank you.
Thanks, Noura. It's good to have a healthy disregard for the impossible. So very supportive of that. Maud, would you like to share some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on Noura's dream. Come back to this idea of codes of conduct or, you know, social media agreements as a tool to hold bad actors accountable, or at the very least to set the standards that can then be called out when they are violated, right? But I think in order for these to be at all effective as a mechanism of deterrence, they need to be verifiable, and there needs to be monitoring mechanisms that accompany them, right? So there's no point having a code of conduct that sets out certain rules of behavior in the online space if we can't then tell when those rules have been violated or not. And so a huge question here is how do we know who's doing what online? And how can we make sure that we can identify and attribute certain behavior to certain actors? So I think the work that DFR Lab and others are doing on this is really helpful and really needs to be, you know, expanded in conflict zones so that we can start. And for that, we also really need the support and the partnership of social media platforms who have access to data that enables attribution. So enables us to say, for example, this network originated in this place. So I think there's really great importance there. I'm also interested in the kind of deterrence effect of social media network takedown. So we see now Facebook releases reports regularly saying we took down a network that originated in this country that was targeting this country. I don't think we have much evidence on whether or not those announcements act as any kind of deterrence, right? Does it have any effect for a country to be told your networks have been taken down, or for an actor to be kind of named and shamed? I think if we could have research that showed whether or not that was having any impact, it would be really helpful for us in thinking about what are the other incentives that might work in this space.
Thanks, Maud. Would love to hear from Mark as well on any potential risks that we're not thinking through here as well.
Thanks, Arjun. I just, wanted to add a cautionary note, because there have been in recent years efforts in different contexts to either shut down the internet overall or to shut down different social media sites. And I think whether that's just an action taken or if it's legislation being proposed. And I think that these issues are really complicated. I think Jane earlier, and I mentioned this before, there are lots of people get information and independent information through social media in a positive way, and there are all these pernicious effects of disinformation and misinformation, and therefore being really clear about the benefits and also the costs of different proposals, right? If you shut down the internet and now someone can't contact a family member to check if they're okay, if they're in the hospital, that has a really difficult effect on that family. And so to weigh that in against, okay, well, that internet shutdown stopped, these actors from saying bad things, that seems an awfully blunt way to try to correct the problem. So as others are looking at legislation and regulatory action, just to keep those balancing tests in mind.
Thanks, Mark. And with that, we're at time. So I really want to thank all the panelists for sharing their wisdom and perspectives on this very important topic. I think sometimes democracy and elections takes up a lot of oxygen around disinformation. So it's really important to put vulnerable communities like those who are in conflict areas, give them a chance, give those conflict zones a chance to be discussed. So with that, I'd love to pass back to Rose Jackson in DC.